My name is Michael
Jody Evans,
I'm the director of the Center for Study of Working Class Life here at Stony Brook. Thank you. This is a double feature here tonight. We have this as the opening plenary session of the How Class Works 2012 conference. So many of you are here to participate in the conference, and this is the opening plenary of that. But by tradition now, this is the 6th How Class Works conference here at Stony Brook, every other year beginning in 2002. So we have had cooperation from many parts of the university in helping to keep this conference going and to keep the Center for Study of Working Class Life going. Student Affairs, and Manny London is the Dean of the College of Business, and we have other people here from the university who have been helpful over the years. This is the Provost Lecture Series. It's the last of the Provost Lectures this academic year, and we're very happy that the Provost has agreed again to facilitate our conference in part by sponsoring this opening plenary, which is open to the public, as well as, of course, to the conference goers. Before we get to the main part of the program, I just have a few announcements having to do with the conference, since this is also the opening session for that. So let me just say that tomorrow morning, there's breakfast begins at 8 o'clock in right next to us. And for those of you who are not yet registered for the conference, registration opens at 8 o'clock in the morning, and if this entices you, you want to participate in the conference, you're welcome to come and register for it tomorrow. Stony Brook students, students and undergraduates attend for free. You know, this little light of mine, let it shine. Let the bushel up off that light and let those students in here. We will be starting the breakfast at 8, and at 9 o'clock is the plenary session on the Occupy movement, labor, and the community, and the experience that those three sectors of the American progressive life had in organizing the May Day demonstration in New York City. So that is free also and open to the public. That plenary session also in Ballroom A. And then the sessions for the conference begin at 10:45 in the morning upstairs on the 3rd floor of this building. And we try to run those in a really organized and tight fashion. We say it starts at 10:45, we mean it starts at 10:45. If anybody has a digital voice recorder and you can bring it to the sessions, please do, so that we can record them, and then we have them in the university archive so that they are available in the future to the public for educational and research purposes. There is a bookstore that the conference has arranged with the university bookstore. It is going to be upstairs in room 309. The books of, there it goes. So glad. The bookstore is in room 309, and it is going to be available all day tomorrow from 10:30 on, and again on Saturday. In your registration packet, there's a flyer that explains it. All the speakers have books that are in the bookstore, and then other interesting titles that you might be looking for. So those are, that's a real opportunity. There's 20% discount, and if they run out of a book, it's free shipping to wherever it goes. So that's one. And then the Center for Study of Working Class Life also has posters and DVDs and pamphlets, which we will have for sale in room 312, also up there. So please do stop by and check out those resources. If you're here for the conference, at the back of the registration packet on the right-hand side, you'll find a conference evaluation form. Please do take the time when you're done and leaving the conference to fill that out. Either leave it at the registration desk in the lobby, or there's an address there where you can mail it back if you get home and say, damn, I forgot to do it. Well, do it then and send it back, please. Tonight, Following a session on song this afternoon, there was enough of enthusiasm and energy that I understand that there's going to be a song fest, or perhaps what used to be called a hoot, in the dorm over here, in the Lauterbur dorm. After this plenary, at some point, people will gather over in the dormitory, and everybody's welcome to go there and just have a good time. That's the whole point here, isn't it? Isn't that what life is all about? So, without any further ado for conference business, I want to introduce Charlie Robbins, who's the Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education and the Dean of the Undergraduate Colleges here at Stony Brook. Charlie has a long history of progressive activity in the social world and is now over in the Provost's office trying to advance undergraduate education, and is a long supporter of the kind of stuff that we're doing here. And I'm very pleased that Charlie is here on behalf of the Provost to introduce our speaker.
This is great to see so many people here tonight. First, let me congratulate the organizers of the whole conference, the 2012 How Class Works Conference, especially Michael Zweig. I think he does an amazing job, and this is just a testament to that. This conference, as you heard, takes place every 2 years, and in my opinion, is high on the list of the most important initiatives that the university takes place here. Throughout my tenure across the street at the School of Social Welfare, focusing on social justice, I was always impressed with the work of the conference, but couldn't quite understand why the work of social welfare and the work of the center never crossed Nichols Road together. So maybe we can get something started there. But the Office of the Provost, which I now represent, is very pleased to be a sponsor of this evening's keynote address. Well before Professor Zweig asked me to do the introduction, I had the lecture already on my calendar. And the timing of tonight's lecture could not be any more important. One just has to follow the recent Republican presidential primary fight or Tuesday's recall election in Wisconsin to see what is probably just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the impact of the Citizens United decision on all of our future. Jeff Clements, our keynote speaker tonight, is the co-founder and president of Free Speech for People, a nonpartisan campaign to overturn Citizens United versus the Federal Elections Commission, and thereby strengthen American democracy and Republican self-government. They're working hard toward the passage of a 28th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution that will in effect overturn the ruling. He's the author of Corporations Are Not People, Why They Have More Rights Than You Do, and What You Can Do About It, which is published this year by Barrett Kohler, and I would suggest that you, while they last, pick up a book after the lecture tonight. Jeff has served as the Assistant Attorney General and Chief of Public Protection Bureau in the Massachusetts Attorney General's Office. As the Bureau Chief, he led more than 100 attorneys and staff in the enforcement of environmental, healthcare, financial services, civil rights, antitrust, and consumer protection laws. In private practice, he has been a partner in the Boston law firms of Mintz Levin and Clements and Clements. I don't know if there's a first and second. He graduated with distinction in history and government from Colby College and magna cum laude from the Cornell Law School in 1988. Please join me in a Stony Brook welcome to tonight's keynote speaker, Jeff Clements.
Thank you so much, Charlie, and thank you, Mike, and the center. I'm so proud to be here. On the question that you asked, Charlie, about whether I'm the first or the second in Clements and Clements law firm, depends on whether you ask me or my brother. And so here I can say I'm the first, but that would be debated. I am very happy to be here with you all tonight, and honored to be asked to give both a Provost lecture as well as the keynote to this fantastic conference. I want to talk about Citizens United. I want to talk about my book, Corporations Are Not People, which is how the case happened, what it means, where it came from, and what we can do not only to overturn the decision, but in my view, to save our country and democracy and give all of us a chance to build the kind of world I think the vast majority of people want to start building. But first let me just say a word or two about class. It's not my subject area. I'm sure there are people here who know much more about how class works in America than I do. I think like a lot of Americans, I tend to hope, perhaps, that class isn't an issue we have to worry about, because of course we all come from somewhere else and we left our class issues behind in our old countries, and here in America we're all equal and free, and that we all can leave the class struggles behind, and that and that anyway there's just one big giant middle class anyway. So what are we worried about? After all, Mitt Romney and free speech for people truly is nonpartisan. I really mean that. You'll see. I'm going to talk about the amendment campaign. Of Republicans oppose Citizens United, want to overturn the decision. It's very important that we hold this American coalition together and not beat each other up, no matter what the professional politicians do with this. But I sometimes can't help talking about Mitt Romney, because he says things like corporations are people, my friend. And on this one he was talking about class in a sense, and I couldn't help noticing as I was thinking about coming here tonight. And he was talking about the tax, basically resisting the idea that maybe we should raise taxes on the rich. And he said that he who has recently reported wealth of $250 million said, it's not those at the low end, and it's certainly not for those at the very high end. It's for the great middle class, the 80 to 90% of us in this country. So that's Mitt Romney and everyone else. We're all just one big middle class. I can't, like a lot of Americans, can't really go into how class works, but that's why this conference is so important, and Mike's program is so important, because we know it's there and it's real, and if we don't acknowledge it, we have trouble moving forward. But I think part of the reason why Americans don't emphasize class so much is there's a great, important, and very large kernel of truth about the story of America. And it is a myth of the giant middle class. It's not 90%, as we know, and it is a myth that we leave class behind when we come to America. But it's not a myth that we are embarked on a remarkable project in this country, that we did set out 240 years ago to make real a very unlikely, radical notion that we could build together. We could build a republic of free and equal people who'll govern ourselves. And when we think about that, we do want it to be true. We want it to be real, that we don't have a class struggle. We are all Americans who are building this together. And in fact, we actually have. We have, it wasn't true when it was stated that all are created equal. It was an aspiration. And it is, as we all know, we make it real every generation. And I say that because the corporate power problem that Citizens United represents, in one sense, you could look at it through the prism of, well, the wielding of power by global transnational corporations and the very few who control them is the ultimate in a class weapon of class warfare. Or you could look at it as I try to do in my book, and as a way I think is equally valuable, and that's that it is our struggle today to move forward along that path to that remarkable but unlikely proposition that we're going to be a free republic of equal equal people who will govern ourselves. If we allow Citizens United to stand, and the idea that corporations are just like us, have the same rights as us, we can't regulate the spending of corporate money in elections, that road to success of the proposition in the Declaration of Independence and in our Constitution is at an end. It will not survive a Citizens United world. It's fragile to begin with. It's why there's checks and balances. It's why there's a Bill of Rights. It's why we have the framers knew what they were doing. The framers of the Constitution had not really succeeded in human history, and there were a lot of dangers to it. And the biggest was concentrated faction, concentrated wealth or military or other faction of power adverse to everybody else. And that's what Citizens United delivers. It delivers the biggest faction ever seen in the face of human history. That's global corporate power. So I want to talk about that and then tell, as I do in my book, where I think this came from. That it wasn't just a bad day on the Supreme Court when they decided it. It was the end game of a 3-decade process that has had a terrible impact on our society, a terrible impact not only for working people, the environment, but on the whole project of we're in this together and that there's such a thing as the public interest or the common good. Citizens United is the end game, and it was a deliberate, well-funded campaign for corporate rights, corporate power. And so I'd like to talk about that. But before I turn to that story, you know, I want to just have a couple of remarks on the class idea, because I think a lot of what's happening now in America is we're becoming disenthralled with some of our myths. And one of those is that we have a giant middle class that will always be the middle class and will always keep getting wealthier and our children will do better and things like that. We now are facing what in a lot of ways is disenthralling of some cherished notions, and we have to figure out how to move forward. But the beginning is some acknowledgement of facts. And so, you know, recently, these facts probably are well known to most of you, but some of them were news to me. An international report on mobility in class recently came out that showed that Americans are actually less likely to have any mobility from how they grew up to how they're likely to do in their lives. That we think part of the myth of why we don't have to talk about class in America is that, well, it's not an immutable characteristic, it's something we control in ourselves and we can change, we just pull up our bootstraps. In fact, we have less mobility than most of Europe, Canada, Australia, much of the world. That's a fact. We know that we have extreme income inequality now, worse than any time since the 1920s. 1% now own 34% of the American wealth. We know that from 1950 to 1980, as the economy grew, the gains were spread widely, wages grew, and that in 1980 that changed. That in the last 30 years, wealth and the economy continued to grow, but it wasn't shared. And in fact, some statistics are quite shocking. In the 1990s, CEO pay went up 600%. Wages fell for 4 out of 5 Americans. We know that in 1980, CEO pay was 42 times the average employee wage. And by the decade of 2000 to 2008, in the financial crash, CEO pay 525 times the average employee salary. Now that the recovery had started in 2010, there's some additional income growth again. Corporate profits actually were quite high in 2010 and 2011. And the trend that we saw in the last 30 years is even worse than ever. 93% of the additional income that resulted from slow but steady recovery went to the top 1% of taxpayers. 93%, the highest ever in American history. So these numbers and the other trends we're seeing really reflect a breakdown of the shared American experience, the shared American project that we will build this, this dream of a republic of free and equal people. And so then Citizens United comes in the middle of all of this, in the middle of the worst economy, the worst economic downfall we've had in several generations. And the court announces in Citizens United that we, the people, are not allowed, literally, we're not allowed to make rules for corporations in elections. Is said by the court of Citizens United to violate the corporate speech rights. And so that's what Citizens United did. It overturned, it struck down the McCain-Feingold law that had restricted independent expenditures, so-called the spending that we're seeing now by corporations. But it did much worse. It said that violates something called corporate speech. It never, by the way, defined what a corporation is or examined why Congress would make one rule for corporations and another rule for human beings, because that's actually what the law that they struck down was, a corporate regulation, not a speech regulation. They instead used words like, Congress can't make different rules for some speakers, but not other speakers. Congress can't silence some voices. And my favorite, Congress is not allowed to make a rule that only applies to a disadvantaged class of person. And that's what Citizens United said in striking down this corporate regulation. But it was worse because it also, they went out of their way for a decision to overturn a century of law. And by that I mean, number one, they struck down a case, they said it was wrong, overturned it, called McConnell versus FEC, which in 2003 said that the very same restriction on spending, corporate spending in elections, that Citizens United struck down, that case only 6 years earlier had said it's perfectly constitutional. That Congress can make a different rule for corporations because corporations are creations of the state. The state, we the people, give corporations privileges like limited liability, perpetual life, things that come from us in our laws that we pass to enable corporations to exist. They don't exist in nature. They exist as creations of the government. And so the McConnell case had said that it's fine for Congress to make a different rule because corporations, the advantages we give them in the economic sphere can be leveraged into the political sphere to destroy the government outformed by the people. Citizens United said that's wrong. Well, it was only 6 years ago. What changed? Well, number one, Chief Justice Rehnquist died, and number two, Sandra Day O'Connor retired, replaced by Samuel Alito and Chief Justice Roberts. And the Supreme Court's not supposed to be like, we won an election, let's have a new vote. It's supposed to be the law. And that was one of the many troubling things about Citizens United. But they went further. They overturned a 1990 case that said states are perfectly entitled to limit corporate spending in elections. And they essentially upended the entire balancing that Americans have tried to do since the founding about corporations. That they're very useful economic tools, but all the way back to Jefferson, Madison, other founders, they were even then talking about corporations can be useful in the economic sphere, so maybe we should allow states to charter them and Congress to charter corporations, but very dangerous in the political sphere, so we have to be careful. Thomas Jefferson, we have to water the tree of liberty with blood every 20 years, always very colorful. He said that he wished to crush in its birth the moneyed aristocracy of corporations that dare already to challenge our government. And that was the most early, primitive corporations compared to what we have now. That trend, James Madison said the same thing, they may be necessary evils, but only with limitations and guards. That view that we have to keep an eye on corporate power is a mainstream American view, carried all the way up. Teddy Roosevelt pushed through the first ban on corporate spending in elections in 1907, the last progressive era, trying to respond to a Gilded Age. So this is mainstream. The court threw that all out in Citizens United. And now all of that would be bad enough, but it doesn't even end there. And that's why I think it's so important that we recognize what Citizens United is about. It's not just arcane, complicated campaign finance law It is a case about power. It's about who makes the rules in this country. And when Citizens United said, we the people are not allowed to make rules about corporations, even though we the people enable corporations to exist under our state laws, that's a direct challenge to every one of you, to me, to all of us. Now, we can decide not to see it as a challenge. We can say, well, okay, the court spoke, we can live with it. But if we don't think we can live with it, we have to respond. And so, you know, not long after the decision, when we launched Free Speech for People, we went down to Washington, met with Donna Edwards, a congresswoman from Maryland. She was one of the first to introduce, she was the first Congress representative to introduce a constitutional amendment to reverse Citizens United. And I'll talk more about that in a second. But she said, looked at us and she said, you know what, this is like the Dred Scott decision. And you know, it took me a minute to think about that because, you know, the Dred Scott decision, as you probably know, 1856, before the Civil War, slavery fighting to expand, not contract and go away. The country divided. The Supreme Court, in its wisdom, said, well, we'll settle this. And 9-0 in the Dred Scott case, they ruled that African Americans, and here's a direct quote that's still in the law books, our Supreme Court reporters, to our shame, the African American has, quote, no rights that the white man is bound to respect. And the Supreme Court thought it was going to settle everything down by just being very clear that we the people did not include African Americans. Good, let's go forward. That was the court's view. Of course, that was a proposition, right in our face. We had to look at that as Americans. We the people, that's what our Constitution says, all are created equal. We rest our whole country on this idea that we're a free republic of equal people who are going to govern ourselves. And the court is telling us that because of skin color, a whole bunch of us aren't included. And that, of course, led to the Civil War, the founding of the Republican Party, as the abolitionists went from being sort of a fringe thing to a mainstream American proposition that we had to push back. And that's what Donna Edwards meant. This is another one of those cases where essentially we are being offered a proposition, transnational corporations of any kind are a part of we the people. We're not allowed to limit their spending. We have to essentially share this experiment with these global corporations. And Donna Edwards and many others know that won't work. We can't do that. That will kill the experiment in we the people of actual real human beings. And to emphasize that, I mean, just think about it. The 100 largest corporations alone had $13 trillion in revenues in the 2008 election cycle. 100 corporations, $13 trillion in revenues. You know, I hate to say it, but we can all send our $25 checks in, but that, you know, it won't make a difference if you're looking at that. And you know, one of the other aspects of this, of course, is those who contribute large amounts of money, because people will tell you, oh, the super PACs that we're now seeing, it's not just corporations, it's billionaires too. Well, that's true. I'm not sure why we should be comforted by that. But we have to recognize, I think, the nexus between the global corporate power and the, you know, and I don't mean this disparagingly, just as a fact, a very small elite that controls global corporations at any one time. That's why you're seeing CEO pay go to extreme levels. And it's been that way even before Citizens United. If you look at the statistics for who contributes money to elections, less than 0.1% of Americans contributed the max $2,300 in 2008. And that amount of money was 60% of the total contributions. So 0.1% of Americans actually contributed money that added up to 60% of the total. Those super PACs, 80% of the money came from 196 donors. 196 donors. 93% of the itemized funds raised by super PACs from individuals came in contributions of at least $10,000. So this is exactly what people said would happen with Citizens United. That American citizens would be turned into, at best, consumers. You know, we watch, we don't get to play, we watch, and then we're supposed to vote like on American Idol or something, as the game has been funded by a very few, very large investors. So Citizens United can't stand, but to overturn it, we have to understand, and we will overturn it. I mean, I'll have a lot of bad news tonight, but the good news is the case will not survive. I'm confident of that. There are so many positive developments. In many ways, it is an opportunity because, like Dred Scott, it said something out loud that people felt, you know, uneasy about already, and now, fine, it's out there. We can address it. But in thinking about how we overturn it, I think we really need to be careful about being clear and just enthralling ourselves, if you will, about what it actually is, what the decision means, and is it really just about money, or is it a larger call to address the problem of corporations and global corporations that have immense power, and that if we fix election contributions, are we really doing enough? And to me, I say no, and my book will explain why, and I'll give you a short version of that tonight, because what we really have to do as citizens is not because corporations are evil or the enemy, or anything, just because they're big, powerful forces in society that need balancing. And we have to renew the old American tradition that we've drifted from in recent years of bringing this idea that corporations need balance and citizen accountability and democratization from the sort of fringe back into the mainstream where it belongs, and I think that's what's happening. And to see that, I want to go back to where this case came from. It wasn't just a bad day on the court, I said, so how did it happen? And everybody hates it, by the way. I mean, some people try to defend it, but very weakly. But the vast majority of Americans are opposed to Citizens United. The polling shows that, by any measure. So how did it happen? I think you have to go back to Earth Day, April 1970. Not the Earth Day that we've seen lately, which is sort of a pale shell, unfortunately, of its original purpose. But the original one, in April 1970, 20 million Americans came out into the streets. Some of you may have been there. And if you weren't, look at some photos of it, and you'll see, again, mainstream Americans from all walks of life out in the streets because of essentially a problem of externalized corporate costs onto the public. That we had a century of industrialization, and we had rivers catching on fire, we had air so toxic, literally the children and elderly were dying. We had absolutely no control on the externalizing of the toxics and the waste and the burdens onto the public, keeping the profits within the corporations. And the American people came out and said, enough. We cannot survive like this. We cannot survive, literally, if we don't change, not just a little thing, not just tweaking, but basic structural change. That's what the Earth Day was about. And you can see that when you look at the reaction, and you can also get a glimmer of memory of what our democracy used to be like, how responsive it was. You know, Richard Nixon was in the White House, and after that Earth Day, and what happened? Within a few months, literally a few months, it started and it had been completed within a few short years, the first Environmental Protection Agency. EPA did not exist until Earth Day, and created by Richard Nixon. The Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Toxic Substances Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Wilderness Act, the Surface Mining Control Act, Endangered Species Act, Marine Mammal Protection Act, Resources Recovery Act, and the first fuel economy standards ever. Can you imagine Congress doing that now? I mean, just this massive change in what the deal was. And now was, okay, we want a good economy, we want a strong economy, but we also need to build in to that system sort of a way of capturing the the toxic results of it, but also of leveling the playing field. It wasn't bad for the economy. It was good for the economy because we had new innovations, new companies that could actually compete better if you weren't allowed to dump the waste onto the public. You had companies coming up with technologies for Clean Water, Clean Air Act compliance, things like that. It changed the whole deal. So we should be celebrating that, right? Well, there was a man, I'm going to tell a story now. My friend Dennis out there said I need to tell a story or two. This book is essentially a story of how we lost our democracy. And the main character is Lewis Powell. Does anybody know Lewis Powell? Some folks know Lewis Powell. He was a Richmond, Virginia lawyer in 1970. He came from a old Virginia family. He was wealthy. He served on the boards of a dozen big corporations. He served on the board and executive committee of the Philip Morris Cigarette Company. And he was an advisor to the Chamber of Commerce. And he looked at Earth Day and some other, signs that democracy was actually functioning very well. It wasn't always pretty, it was often messy, but democracy was pushing for change that people wanted, and people were getting that change. He was appalled and worried, and he wrote a memo called Attack on the Free Enterprise System. And it's a remarkable document. It goes on for some pages. It was a memo to the Chamber of Commerce. And he basically outlined a game plan to the Chamber to end this sort of, responsiveness of Congress and the government to the people. He called for a multi-year, as long as it took, organized corporate takeover, essentially, of government. And you may think I'm exaggerating. You can check out the memo yourself. Much of it's in the book, but it's also online. That's new, by the way. It was secret at the time. But here's some of the things he said in this memo as a way of responding to these developments. 1971, this is the memo to the Chamber of Commerce from Lewis Powell. But independent and uncoordinated activity by individual corporations, as important as this is, will not be sufficient. Strength lies in organization, in careful long-range planning and implementation, in consistency of action over an indefinite period of years, in the scale of financing available only through joint effort, and in the political power available only through united action and national organization. And if you don't think this is Citizens United is about power, Powell's memo said, political power is necessary. That power must be assiduously cultivated. When necessary, it must be used aggressively and with determination, without embarrassment and without reluctance. Now, again, he's talking about corporate power, corporations funding and organizing this. And he says, especially with an activist-minded Supreme Court, the judiciary may be the most important instrument for social, economic, and political change. Now, all of us maybe sometimes see something going on and we write out our rant. And you could say, oh, that's Lewis Powell's rant. He said, yeah, corporations should take over and fund this multi-year campaign and so on. But it's exactly what happened. The Chamber took it seriously. The Chamber of Commerce took it very seriously. They formed in response to the National Chamber Litigation Center and started boosting intense lobbying efforts. And I want to say a quick digression on the Chamber of Commerce. It's not like, as you may know, it's not like your local chamber in your town. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce is a front for a very few big global corporations. They say they represent 3 million American businesses. That's false. 40% of the Chamber's budget comes from just a very few corporations. And just to give some examples, they got a check, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce got a check for $86 million, one contribution, nearly half their spending that year, 2009. The check came from the private health insurance corporation's lobbying group to try to stop public health care reform, public option, things like that, and succeeded. It was one check, it was nearly half their spending. Now, why didn't they just spend it? Why did they run it through the chamber so they could make it look like American business was against healthcare reform, when of course American business was actually bearing the burden of a dysfunctional healthcare system that single payer or public option probably would have significantly improved, not only for all of us, but for business as well. But by running it through the chamber, it looks like, okay, maybe business is somehow against reform. That is the standard operating procedure. They call themselves a $200 million lobbying machine. The president of the chamber said, when we bite you on the butt, you bleed, his words, and he's telling that message to Congress. And 40%, I said, of the funds, 25 corporations fund 40% of the chamber. So that's the chamber, but it didn't just stop there. You may have heard about ALEC recently, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which gets a corporate agenda into all of our state houses secretly. That was started in response to the Powell memo. Wherever you live in your region of America, there's something called a blank legal foundation. We've got our New England Legal Foundation, there's the Pacific Legal Foundation, the Washington Legal Foundation. It's another corporate-funded attack machine, essentially. They file litigation against public interest laws, they file amicus briefs, they file case after case to create this notion of corporate speaker, corporate voice, corporate person in our Constitution. That's where that came from. It was invented by Lewis Powell and these foundations. Now, what happened to Lewis Powell? He writes this memo. They respond to it. He goes on the Supreme Court. 6 months after writing this memo, Richard Nixon appointed Lewis Powell to the Supreme Court. And it would have been a really interesting debate before the Senate Judiciary Committee. He said, you have this memo, Mr. Powell, you say, activist-minded Supreme Court to change the legal, social, and economic structure of America? What in the world do you have in mind? We never had that debate. The memo wasn't disclosed. The Senate Judiciary Committee didn't get the memo from Lewis Powell. They didn't get it from the Chamber of Commerce. We never had the debate. It came out after he was already on the bench. Now, again, this is obviously not just about Lewis Powell. It's about a corporate power movement, if you will. But Lewis Powell, when he was Justice Lewis Powell, went on to write 4 decisions in about 6 years that created the doctrine that Citizens United applied. It created, for the first time in American history, something called corporate speech. So that corporations are speakers. That didn't used to exist. In fact, just the opposite. The whole idea of commercial speech was not considered part of the First Amendment idea. Now, whether commercial speech should be or not is a question for another day, but the whole notion of corporations as speakers, voices that we can't regulate, came from Lewis Powell, and these 4 decisions, 5-4 decisions, built the framework. And I won't go through all of them, but let me just talk about one, because in a sort of conference on how class works, it raises some interesting questions. This was a case called Bellotti versus First National Bank of Boston. It was in 1978 from my now home state of Massachusetts. And Bellotti was the Attorney General. And remember, in his memo, Lewis Powell had said corporations have to organize, they have to work together, they have to fund multi-year efforts to take power. And it wasn't just those groups I mentioned that responded. In Massachusetts, we had a law then in the 1970s that said in citizen referenda, citizen ballot initiatives, we don't want corporate money coming into it. The ballot initiative for citizen vote on something, corporations keep corporate money out of it. Of course, executives, shareholders, director, employees, they can all do whatever they want to do as individuals, but the corporate funds were not supposed to be used in citizen ballot initiatives under Massachusetts law. Well, Bank Boston, First National Bank of Boston as it was known then, Gillette Corporation, and Digital Equipment Corporation got together and sued to attack that law. The corporate lawyers argued that the law violated the free speech of those corporations. And now that was a novel theory. The corporations, again, traditionally in the law, and they're thought of as creations of the state. You get a state charter if you want to start a corporation. Those 3 corporations are probably all from Delaware, where most of the large corporations now are chartered. And they weren't traditionally viewed as, they're viewed as persons for some kinds of purposes, but in our constitutional Bill of Rights as speakers, no, not at all. And that's why the Massachusetts Supreme Court said, denied, the law stands. Well, they appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and Lewis Powell wrote the decision, 5-4, struck down the Massachusetts law. First time in American history, 200 years, that a campaign or election law limiting corporate spending had ever been struck down. And so one of the things that, as I mentioned, related to the class question is what the referenda that got these corporations so up in arms about. Well, it was a referenda about whether Massachusetts should have a progressive income tax. We didn't have a progressive income tax then. Now, the progressive income tax would have been a personal tax that had nothing to do with corporations, but that's what Bank Boston, Gillette, and Digital Equipment Corporation wanted to stop. And they did. We still don't. 30 years later, we don't have a progressive income tax in Massachusetts. Now there's a footnote. You know, the corporations then, those three corporations argued and asked, like, why do you want to spend your money in a question of citizen income taxes? It has nothing to do with the corporations. They said, well, if we can't stop this, we will have a hard time recruiting executives to come to Massachusetts. And so therefore, we have to have a right to spend money, even if the people of Massachusetts don't want us to, in your citizen referendum. So in that under that theory, that should have all worked well for everybody, because we would have gotten crackerjack executives who came to Massachusetts, right, and run great companies. Well, here's what happened. Here's the end. What we now know: Digital Equipment Corporation doesn't exist anymore. They sold themselves to Compaq, laid off 15,000 people, and paid the CEO $6.5 million. Now that sounds like a lot, but that CEO was in some ways a chump, because Bank Boston sold itself to Fleet, laid off 5,000 employees, and paid the CEO $25 million. Fleet then, as you may recall, sold itself to Bank of America, laid off 13,000 people, paid the CEO $35 million. Gillette isn't Gillette anymore. It's now part of Procter & Gamble. The CEO who arranged that was a man named James Kiltz. He laid off 1,000 people, and maybe he felt so good that, you know, compared to 15,000 people, laying off 1,000 is commendable. They paid him $180 million on the merger. So every state in the country could probably repeat these kind of situations, and that's the change. In the Bellotti case that Lewis Powell wrote back in 1978, it was a question of power. Do we, the people, have power to decide who participates in our citizen referenda? We lost that. The power was exerted, and we saw the results. The other cases were environmental cases. Environmental laws struck down under the theory that utility corporations are speakers and voices that can't be, quote-unquote, silenced, or in other words, regulated. So those are the cases, and Lewis Powell went off the bench in the mid-'80s. But that theory kept going, and it ended in the Citizens United case with the ultimate. You know, not just state law, not just environmental regulation. We also, by the way, had tobacco regulation struck down. We had a law in Massachusetts, 1,000 feet buffer zones around schools for Joe Camel and cigarette advertising, because we knew they were illegally targeting children. That was struck down as a corporate speech violation. This kept going until it ended in Citizens United. And I want to just give a few illustrations about why it's not just a constitutional lawyer obsession, but should be an obsession of all of us, about why it's corporate power, not just spending money in elections. And one story is, I tell in the book, is of Dexter Randall. He's a dairy farmer in upstate Vermont, the Northeast Kingdom, as they call it, organic dairy farmer. And in the 90s, he heard about Monsanto developing something called RBST, recombinant bovine growth hormone, essentially. Genetically modified bovine growth hormone. It's injected into the blood of cows, dairy cows, and it forces them to produce more milk than a cow possibly could, naturally, which of course makes the cow very sick. The mastitis rates go way up. They then begin pumping the antibiotics into the cows, and they have a factory essentially to crank out milk. Now, there's a lot of questions about this, to say the least. In the 90s, there were studies showing serious human health impacts of milk that came from cows treated this way. That social impacts, certainly for organic dairy farmers like Dexter Randall, who were hardly getting rich on milk prices. And hardly, you know, the last thing they needed was genetically modified milk flooding the market. Obviously animal welfare questions, all sorts of others. And that's why in virtually every functioning democracy in the world, it's illegal. No government in Europe, Australia, Japan, Canada approved this. They said no, the people did not want this kind of agriculture production, this kind of economy, this kind of, you know, transformation of our food and economy to the likes of Monsanto. Not our country. Dexter Randall went to the FDA, he organized his neighbors, he did everything that we're supposed to do as citizens in this country. FDA, he said they wouldn't listen. They just were totally dominated by Monsanto, Food and Drug Administration, and they approved this. He didn't give up. He went back to Vermont, and they passed a law after a lot of work, overcoming the Monsanto lobbyists, which takes some doing, I'll tell you, to require that on the label of dairy products, it would be disclosed that the milk or ice cream or butter came from cows injected with RBST. We would at least have the knowledge, and we could decide for ourselves whether to buy that or not. Or we could buy Dexter Randall's milk. Maybe it would cost a little bit more, but we would be able to make that choice. If people didn't care about RBST, they could make that choice. Now Monsanto opposed this vigorously and argued, people, how can you be against disclosure? How can people not have the right to know what's in our food? And they said it would cause fear and uncertainty. and so we shouldn't be able to do that. And they went further. They said, you go ahead and you pass that law, we're going to strike it down. It's a violation of our corporate speech right. They won that case. They did sue. That Vermont law got struck down. And people would say, well, what speak? We want, if you call them speakers if you must, but we wanted them to speak. Tell us, is it in there? They said, Monsanto said, no, you don't understand. We have a right not to speak when we don't want to. And so that's what it has come to, where every other democracy on the planet doesn't even allow this, let alone is prevented from disclosing it to us. We have it. We're not allowed to know about it because we'd be fearful and uncertain, perhaps. And we are prohibited from making a law like that because that's said to violate the constitutional rights of the likes of Monsanto. So that's just one example, and there's many others. I'm sure you all could talk about them as well. But I think I'll just close with perhaps the saddest one before turning to the good news. And that's what's happening in West Virginia and Appalachia with mountaintop mining removal. If you want to see what the future of America looks like under a corporate-dominated government, go to West Virginia. 500 mountains don't exist anymore. They're gone. 500 of the Appalachian Mountains, some of the best, most precious ecosystem on the planet, have been destroyed to get coal out without actually having to employ too many people. It's not for jobs. Mining jobs have actually gone way down in the past decades because it's much more efficient if you can blow up a mountain, get rid of the mountain, dump it into the rivers and streams and the valleys, and just take the coal out that way. It's absolutely outrageous. Bobby Kennedy calls it a criminal enterprise. I think he's quite right about that. If you or me or any of us filled 10 feet of a stream, we'd be worried about DUP or going to jail. 2,500 miles of headland streams in Appalachia are gone. They've been filled with the mountain rubble that has been blown off, and the mountains are gone. Communities are destroyed. They're literally gone. The people lived in these areas. They were told to move on. I was down there last June and talking to people who are used to drink fresh mountain spring water. They're driving 50 miles to get bottled water because their water's destroyed. And then it all came to a head with the Upper Big Branch mine explosion in Massey Energy's coal mine. 29 mine workers were killed. And in the report as to how it happened, it's a remarkable document actually, because instead of the usual just, well, it happened like this, and then going very technical about what sparked what explosion, 29 workers died, oh, isn't that too bad, onward. They said, no, this happened because Massey Energy corrupted the West Virginia government and the federal government so that the government was no longer doing what it was supposed to do to enforce the law and protect workers. The Massey had 62,000 violations of mine safety laws. They were never not enforced, even though they noted 62,000 times they violated. They had 13,000 violations of Clean Water Act. Nothing was done. And as a direct result, according to this report, and any other report that looks at it, 29 men are dead as a direct result of that, on top of all the other damage. That is out of control corporate power, and it's coming to all of us if we don't do something. You know, the United Mine Workers did a report on that explosion. The title of the report is Industrial Homicide. And that's what it was. That's what it was. So what are we going to do about this? You know, that's what Citizens United is validating. Citizens United is saying that not only this is the way it is, Citizens United is saying there's nothing you can do about it. That if you want to control corporate spending, no, you're not allowed to. That there's something called a free speech right of corporations. You want to try to get accountable corporations? No, you can't. So we can live with that or not. And fortunately, there's so many Americans who are saying, no, we can't live with that. We're going to change that. And it's nonpartisan. It is a broad movement, and that is the really good news. So let me switch, now that you're all depressed, and say why this can be the next few years can be the greatest, you know, years of our lives and perhaps of American history, because things have gotten to such a point that people are doing things that, you know, the scoffers would have said, oh, that will never happen. And so let's start with the constitutional amendment. Maybe you've heard about this movement. There's a lot of groups working on it. We launched Free Speech for People on the day of the decision to build a constitutional amendment movement, a 28th Amendment, to say that corporations are creatures of the state. They don't have the same rights as people in our Constitution. That we can regulate spending in elections. And why do we need a constitutional amendment? Well, we've done that 27 times before. 7 of those were when the Supreme Court ruled in a way that Americans said, no, that is not what we're about. Just like that Dred Scott case. The Supreme Court ruled women don't have the right to vote. The Supreme Court ruled we're not allowed to have a progressive income tax in America. That got overturned by a constitutional amendment. 7 times. And so the question for us is, are we somehow weaker than people who came before us? Those struggles were just as hard, faced just as big odds, and they won. And we have to win this one. We have to get a constitutional amendment to overturn the court. It's how the system was supposed to work. It's why we have Article 5 of the Constitution, which says that we can amend the Constitution. It's a big lift. We need 2/3 of Congress, 3/4 of the states to ratify what 2/3 of Congress does. But let me give you some good news. So in only 2 years, we have millions of Americans who've signed petitions to support a constitutional amendment. There are now more than a dozen amendment versions already introduced in Congress. The People's Rights Amendment, which is a very important one in my view because it goes at the corporate power piece as well as the money in elections. It's one of the few bipartisan ones, and it's been introduced by Congressman Jim McGovern of Massachusetts, but with a Republican co-sponsor, Walter Jones of North Carolina. Has over 25 co-sponsors, and it would say corporations do not have the rights of the people under our Constitution. They're subject to regulation as the people see fit. And that's one of many, as you may have heard of. Senator Sanders has an amendment as many, and that's a good problem. We do need to get down to 1 or 2 in the end, but that is a good debate. We're seeing lots of good versions of these amendments, but we can't just wait for Washington. We can't say, oh, Congress, get it done, Congress, get it done. We have to organize and build this movement, just like all those other campaigns did to get America to stay on this road to this republic of free and equal people. And so how are we doing that? We're organizing in communities across the country. People are doing it organically. We have lots of tools on Free Speech for People, Move to Amend, People for America, lots of Common Cause. There's lots of tools out there, but they have to be used by the people, and that's what's happening. Hundreds of cities and towns across the country have passed resolutions saying Citizens United is wrong, we need a constitutional amendment to reverse it. Congress sent an amendment reversing Citizens United to the states for ratification. I come from Massachusetts, as I said. We have New England town meetings still, where everyone in town over 18 is a legislator in effect. And we had our town meeting, and we had that resolution. I live in Concord, and we had that resolution up, and it was wonderful to see people stand up. They say their name, their address, and they say what they think about these resolutions, about this resolution. And I know people who were Republican conservatives standing up and saying this is wrong, I support this resolution, and liberal Democrats saying I support this resolution, passed overwhelmingly. 62 towns did that in Massachusetts recently. Big cities have done it, Boston, New York, LA, both Portlands. So this is happening all over the country. And so I would urge you, wherever you live, you can help get this done too. And it doesn't have to pick what the language is. The message is to Congress, we mean it, get to work, send an amendment to the states for ratification. Keep the pressure on, keep organizing. I think there's some folks here from Move to Amend in Brookhaven, and you can check them out. I think they've got resolutions actually circulating, so look for them if you live in this area. And just check online, freespeechforpeople.org or movetoamend.org or any of the others to find where you can get involved. But it's not just the towns and cities. 4 states have now done this. State policy, Massachusetts is close, I hope we'll do it. Vermont, Rhode Island, New Mexico, and Hawaii have all passed resolutions. Other states are very close to it. Maryland, Connecticut have circulated letters signed by the vast majority of legislators saying we want an amendment. So it's happening across the country, and I would urge you to join this effort. Other issues like corporate accountability. After that Massey explosion, Free Speech for People, we're going after Massey's corporate charter. Massey's a corporation under Delaware law. Delaware, like every state in the union, has a law that says if corporations violate the law repeatedly, their charter is subject to revocation. And that reminds us that these entities they're a privilege from we, the people. We give them benefits like limited liability, but we say, do good, serve the public. If you break the law, hurt the public interest, you could lose your corporate charter. That law has been ignored for decades, and we can't ignore it anymore. So we've petitioned to the Attorney General of Delaware, Bo Biden, to use his power, which he has, to initiate a proceeding to revoke Massey Energy's corporate charter. We're supported by 35,000 people, Rainforest Action Network, and Appalachian Voices. So we have to reinvigorate these tools of citizenship that we have, and we are doing that. And it's, as I said, a very exciting time. And it is what politicians need. Nobody's going to do this for us. The judges aren't going to fix it. Most politicians aren't going to fix it. We can help them fix it, those who want to. And since we've started this, when everybody said, oh, it'll never go anywhere, not only do we have all those amendment bills introduced in Congress, we have 11 attorney generals of states who have called for a constitutional amendment. We have Montana pushing back on the Supreme Court. And I will just close quickly with that case. I have a couple of minutes. In Montana, you may have heard, Attorney General Steve Bullock said after Citizens United was decided that, in Montana, we've had a law on the books since 1912 that banned corporate spending in elections. I haven't seen any constitutional amendment that says we're not allowed to do that, and I don't know what Citizens United saw in terms of corporate corruption, but we know in Montana we had it. We used to be owned by the Anaconda Copper Company, and the people rose up and passed this law in 1912 by referendum because of literally bags of cash handed out on the state house floor by the corporation. The corporations picked the senator who would go to Congress, because senators were appointed then. Another constitutional amendment, by the way. That's why we elect senators now. He said, I'm not going to be the Attorney General who lets this die without a fight. And basically he was saying, sue me, and they did. He was sued by a corporate front group called Western Tradition Partnership. They always have great names, Citizens United, Western Tradition Partnership, American Crossroads, Americans for Apple Pie. So they sued him, and he defended the law. We filed an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief in the case, making some of the arguments I've outlined tonight. And we were joined by two Montana businesses, two Montana business corporations. We were joined by the American Sustainable Business Council, the American Independent Business Alliance, because we want to make a point that this is not anti-business, this is not about somehow limiting businesses. This is about giving American businesses a chance to prosper and innovate and do all the things we want them to do without being dominated by the big global corporations. And much to everyone's surprise, I wish I could say I wasn't surprised, but I was, we won. And it was a surprise because the Citizens United case was pretty clear that state laws like this are not constitutional. But we won 5-2 in the court. And the justices, the 5 justices said in the Montana Supreme Court, not the U.S. Supreme Court, the Montana Supreme Court, they said that, okay, we see Citizens United, but Citizens United couldn't have meant, even if we have overwhelming evidence of corruption by corporate money in elections, we can't do anything about it. So we're going to assume that the court didn't mean that and say even under Citizens United our law stands. Well, 2 justices said, nah, we can't do that. Citizens United is the law of the land. We're a state Supreme Court. We have to follow it. One of those justices, though, Justice Nelson, went out of his way to say that although he thought they had to follow Citizens United, he didn't like it. And I just want to close by reading what he said. He was a Republican justice, appointed by a Republican governor. And I say that because, again, you have to realize this is an opportunity for Americans to come together and win the struggle of our times. Because just listen to what Justice Nelson said. Well, as a member of this court, that's the Montana Supreme Court, I am bound to follow Citizens United. I do not have to agree with it. And to be absolutely clear, I don't. For starters, the notion that corporations are disadvantaged in the political realm is unbelievable. Indeed, it has astounded most Americans. The truth is that corporations wield inordinate power in Congress and in state legislatures. It is hard to tell where government ends and corporate America begins. The transition is seamless and overlapping. Again, we're beginning to see, coming back to the mainstream, things. If you heard that, you would have thought, oh, that must be some radical. No, it's a Republican Supreme Court justice in Montana. And he says, lastly, I'm compelled to say something about corporate personhood. I find the entire concept offensive. Corporations are artificial creatures of law. As such, they should enjoy only those powers, not constitutional rights, but legislatively conferred powers that are concomitant with their legitimate function, that being limited liability investment vehicles. Corporations are not persons. Human beings are persons, he said, and it is an affront to the inviolable dignity of our species that courts have created this fiction, which forces people, human beings, to share fundamental natural rights with soulless creations of government. Worse still, he wasn't done. Worse still, while corporations and human beings share many of the same rights under the law, they clearly are not bound equally to the same codes of good conduct, decency, and morality, and they are not held equally accountable for their sins. Indeed, Justice Nelson closed, it is truly ironic that the death penalty and hell are reserved only for natural persons. So that's a Republican justice in Montana speaking out, and that's what this is about. This is about creating the space for Americans to speak out and say the truth, which we haven't been saying enough. And we've been silenced by this. You know, we didn't realize the power struggle we were in, and now we realize it. And I think, like Abraham Lincoln said in another time of challenge, the question now is not can any of us imagine better, but can we all do better? This was the speech when he said about how important the question was whether we will nobly save or meanly lose, the last best hope on earth. But you know, he said something that I think applies equally to us today. The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with that occasion. As our case is new, so what must we think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we will save our country. So thank you very much. It's great to be here with you. And
I think it was County Park, but it might have been our place. there was a sign that said, "I believe corporations are people who Texas execute." That's still along the same line. Here's what the evening has in store for us. Out of this room, gone by 9 o'clock. There are books over here, and we'll have a book signing, so we should save, I would think, at least 20 minutes for that. And so I would say that we have 20 minutes for questions and commentary and discussion. I will ask, let's see if this goes down here, or if anybody can figure out how to get this going. Let's just come on down over here if you've got a question. I think that's the way to do it, because I don't have a mic that is standing.
I can repeat the question too.
What?
I can repeat the question when I answer.
All right, why don't we do that way? You ask your question here, and Jeff will repeat it quickly.
Jeff, there are two issues. One is the ability to contribute unlimited amounts of money, and the other is to do it anonymously. Could you clarify for us what Citizens United said about that second thing?
Sure. So the question is about disclosure, and what did Citizens United say about that? Well, actually, Citizens United said we are allowed to have disclosure laws. The reason we don't is because Citizens United struck down the McCain-Feingold law, which banned this kind of spending we're seeing now. So there was no disclosure requirement because it was illegal. You didn't disclose it, you just didn't do it. So Congress could have passed a disclosure law after Citizens United. It got filibustered in the Senate. The Disclose Act did not pass. We should do that. It is not a fix, though, in my view. It's a necessary thing, but not nearly enough. You know, a lot of this is known. We don't need disclosure to know Sheldon Adelson is spending $15 million and now probably another $10 million through super PACs. We don't need disclosure to know Alpha Natural Resources, the coal corporation that now owns Massey Energy, is spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe probably a lot more, but that leaked out. They actually probably want politicians to know. You know, corporations like Target that deal with consumers have to be careful, and they hide it because people get really mad when corporations are meddling in our elections. Some corporations like coal companies, they don't deal with us as customers. They deal with utility corporations or Chinese utility corporations. They want politicians to know that they're going to spend to take them out if the politicians oppose them. So disclosure it's a crime that it hasn't happened, that we don't have disclosure laws now, but let's not settle for that too. So thank you for the question. It's a good one. Citizens United does not prevent disclosure.
I think this, I'm told, now works, and I believe it does. So, here's the question. Keep them brief, please.
Okay, just as a footnote to that, NPR today had the actual speech of Justice Kennedy when he read the decision, and he specifically said that disclosure laws were okay.
Right. And it was actually 8-1 on that score. Justice Thomas was the only one who thought disclosure laws were unconstitutional.
Well, let me ask you just to follow up on that. My understanding of the disclosure law is that companies can get away from that by setting up shell companies.
Yeah.
And the disclosure is that ABC Corporation is given the money, but who the hell is ABC Corporation? So you do have disclosure of the proximate sources of money, but you still can't find out, even with the disclosure law, where the money really comes from.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So you may hear, oh, super PACs have to file reports with the FEC. So what are you complaining about? They do. And if you can look at the report and see that, you know, Americans for Apple Pie gave $10 million to a super PAC. Who gave the money to Americans for Apple Pie? We don't know. So I'm making up the name, of course, but it's called a C4 corporation. It's another entity. So they can set up that intermediary shell corporation to put the money into, which then makes the contribution to the super PAC. So when it's reported, you don't really know where it came from.
Isn't the C4 an explosive?
Yeah. Yeah, it is.
On that issue, I think Steve Colbert explains it better than anyone.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming this evening and speaking on this vital issue. My name is Steve. I represent a group called Move to Amend Brookhaven. We're trying to get a resolution passed in the town of Brookhaven the largest town in the state of New York.
That's where we are here.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
I knew that.
We have members all around the room. Please, folks, before you leave, please, it's important to, our politicians loathe to bite the hand that feeds them. We're going to have to move this from the ground up. We have to show that there's a movement behind this. Before we get their attention, please sign our petition. And Mr. Clement, we're going out in the community. We're meeting civic groups, Chamber of Commerce, clubs. We find warmth with everyone, but to be honest, we're not finding warmth from conservatives. We actually went with a riot in a meeting the other night. People want to throw us out because they don't understand what we stand for. This is a truly a nonpartisan issue. What language can I use, can we use to communicate to the conservatives? What key words can I use, we can use, to get them to understand that this is toxic for their democracy as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because it is challenging. It's a particularly challenging. First, I commend your efforts of all of you and move to amend Brookhaven. It's fantastic, and I hope you win that resolution. The question about the conservatives isn't a very important one. I'm probably not the most qualified person to answer. I wish we had a conservative who could answer it directly here tonight. But we have also worked very hard to capitalize and nurture what the polling shows, and I think is true, that all Americans are troubled by where we are right now. The problem is we're also in the middle of an election. And as we saw in Wisconsin, there are short-term advantages for one side to get a lot of money. And I think it would not be controversial to say Republicans are getting more of that share of the money liberated, if you will, by Citizens United. And so my advice, for what it's worth, is we have to not give up. We have to not get frustrated and go back to attacking conservatives as wrong. And your comment about language is a really interesting one, because there almost are two different languages now. I didn't realize democracy was a bad word in some quarters, but it is. And not a bad word as such, but you will hear, hold it, hold it, hold it, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. It's okay. So now I say Republican democracy, small r, small d, and that's right, we are a republic. The concern about small government is a real, valid one. That's, many Americans believe. We should have a more decentralized government. We should have more local controls of everything. And that, that's a big argument. I think we have to ask patiently, work with them, look for spokespeople who recognize that small government won't happen with global corporate control of the federal government. And I talk about some examples in the book. If you're concerned about debt, if you're concerned about big government, Citizens United is a disaster for you. The corporate control of Washington feeds big government, and not the good part of big government. Medicare Part D is an example, passed under the Bush administration, bipartisan support, written by lobbyists for big pharma. And the law prevents the government from negotiating for Medicare prices. So we are paying a massive amount, billions and billions of taxpayer dollars straight into the corporate treasuries of the big global pharma corporations. That's because of government control. And I think we just have to look for the issues and look for the people who recognize their issue, even if they're conservative, or especially if they're conservative, is threatened by big transnational corporate power over our government. And we have to, frankly, put aside some of our arguments. Not put them aside, but take them other places. And that's what we call transpartisan. It means you don't sort of meet in the middle. You keep your values, your principles, you fight for it, but you look for the things you have in common that you can help win. And this is one of them. So it is hard, though. I won't underestimate it. But I think after the election, the environment might get better for that. And we just have to not give up and just patiently keep pressing this issue, and we will get some Republicans. We have, by the way, at least 3 Republican attorneys generals now are supporting the Montana pushback. There'll be a ballot initiative in Montana, no matter what the Supreme Court decides, calling for an end to corporate personhood under our Constitution, calling for a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. The first 2 signatures on that, Montana Governor Brian Schweitzer, a Democrat, Lieutenant Governor John, I forgot his last name, he's a Republican. So there are opportunities, there will be more opportunities, and we just have to keep pushing for them. Hi.
Oh, hi. Both the Republicans and, to a lesser extent, but still Democrats have become very accustomed to getting large donations from, corporations. This has just become part of how our political process works. So I'm a little skeptical that they can be persuaded to dismantle this system that they've gotten so used to working in. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, another great question. So, and also another area where I won't, give you a rosy, easy answer, because there isn't one. But I will give you some history, which you all know, and we just have to keep reminding ourselves of, which is, an all-male, unelected Senate did not want to pass a 2/3 vote to give women the right to vote and to have senators be elected. They didn't do that because they wanted to. They did it because the American people forced it. And this one is the same. A lot of people in politics may be used to this system and not really want to change it, and it's up to us to make it happen. The choice, unfortunately, is to say, well, it's going to be too hard, we can't do it, so let's not try, or to say, well, it's not any harder than those other ones, which only happened because people pushed and pushed and pushed. Let's start pushing. And so I vote for the latter one, and I hope we all do too. And it'll be hard work. It won't happen quickly. But that's why we have to do all the work outside of Washington too.
I think you just answered my question.
Okay.
Keep it short. I wanted to remind everybody the full Jefferson quote is the Tree of Liberty is watered with the blood of patriots and tyrants. So the tyrants don't just bleed from paper cuts. The patriots force them to. So, and the patriots bleed too. They have to sacrifice. Real direct. What would the various amendments that are being discussed right now, what effect, if any, would they have on Buckley versus Vallejo, which is about speech, money as speech, or would it have any effect? Would Buckley be a way for corporations to get around, or individuals rather, get around?
Yeah, great question. So Buckley versus Vallejo was a 1978 case, again, the same time period of the Bellotti case. It said that when you hear money is speech, that's where that came from. That the campaign laws that were passed after the scandals of Watergate had limits on independent expenditures, spending by people and corporations. And the Supreme Court in Buckley said that we are not allowed to regulate independent spending, quote unquote independent. And so that case came together in Citizens United with the rule about corporations. So these amendments would overturn Buckley. I think we need to do both. We need to take back the Constitution and our Bill of Rights for human beings, not corporations. And we need to say we, the people, can make rules about spending in elections so that we all have a voice. We all have a fair voice. And there's several versions of the amendment take on that question of the money and the spending, and would overturn Buckley as well as Citizens United.
Let me just make an announcement. I said earlier that there was going to be like a hoop sing-along out in the dorm. I now have the information. It is at 9 o'clock at Lauderburg, and they're preparing a public hall, like a public space in Lauderburg, which is very close to here. So if this is over, head over there and have a good time. As though this were enough of a good time.
I haven't heard on NPR on this. The issue came up also at a movement toward impeachment for making this decision. And I was just wondering, if you had any thought about that, and how any effort toward that, how it would play towards an issue of creating an amendment to the Constitution.
Yeah, in my view, impeachment is not the answer here. What we have is a struggle about who makes the rules, who writes the what our Constitution means. And as I said, we've had these decisions go back and forth. So, 5-4 decision only 6 years ago saying that the law that was struck down in Citizens United is constitutional. Court changes, 5-4, now it isn't constitutional. And this happens sometimes where the judges can't sort it out. And impeachment of 1 or 2 judges isn't going to change that. There'll be another judge appointed. This is a question for us. We now have to decide it, and we have to settle it. So I think our energy needs to go into building the constitutional amendment, to winning it, and taking it out of the judge's hands, rather than trying to take the judge out of the court, because that won't be a sure fix. It's a genuine, serious debate about a fundamental proposition of American constitutional law and life, and that's our job. We can settle that just like we settled all the other fundamental issues in the 27 amendments that came before. So I think that's the way I would go, and I think impeachment is not really right for this court. Is as corporate dominated a court as I think we've had in our history. I used to say the Gilded Age court was the most corporate court ever. I think they've outdone them. I get as angry as anybody else about the politicization of the court. But in my view, we have this wonderful tool, Article 5, where we have the last word, and I think that's how we should do it.
Yeah, let me just interject here about myself for a minute here with a question following up on this. You know the old fable about the mice and the cat? The mice are playing around and the owner of the house gets a cat. The cat comes and captures a mice and eats a mouse. And the other mice get very upset and they run away. And the next night, the cat is back and eats another mouse. And then the mice get together and say, you know what we need to do? We need to protect ourselves. We need to know when the cat is coming. And so one mouse has this really smart idea. We're going to put a bell around the neck of the cat. And then when the cat approaches, we will hear the bell ring and we'll all run away. Great idea. And the fable ends with this question: who will bell the cat? Now, I hear a lot of discussion in America, not just tonight, about the power of capital and the need to put boundaries on that power. And that's as far as we got to pull a bell around a cat. Who is actually going to do that? I don't think it's enough to say the American people. I don't think it's enough to say the 99%. This is a country where the majority of people is the working class. This is a country, if we're going to talk about democracy and empowering the majority of the people, it can't escape the question of class. And we have to understand that exactly the court and the direction of the Powell memo for 40 years has been also to dismember organized labor, to dismember the organized power of working people. And if we don't find a way to respond now for the next 30 or 40 years with our own Powell memorandum to empower working people, not just through unions, but through every possible means of public organization, and to call it out explicitly that that is what we have to do, I don't think we're going to win. Because I don't think you can bell the cat without having a clear class understanding of what is going on. That is what the Center for Study of Working Class Life is about. That is what this conference, How Class Works, is about. Because exactly what you've been talking about tonight, Jeff, is how class works, except it's their class. And now we have to get ourselves organized as us. And to the question about what do you do with small business, small business is just like workers in some ways, that they are living under the thumb of big corporations. They're like big corporations because they're businesses, and they don't like unions because businesses don't like to be able to have to deal with their workers. But I think if we approach as a workers' movement, the middle class of small business, with the understanding that we are with them against that power that equally suppresses them, I think we have some opportunity. But you don't get that without a class understanding, without a class analysis. And I just wondered, where that fits into that sense of agency in terms of class in your narrative, and how you would want to integrate that, if you would. Yeah,
I agree with that. I think we see the outcomes of the corporate power, the corporate takeover, are outcomes that essentially are about making America, this very special project, just another global market where there's a very small elite and a very, very large impoverished class of people. That's the stakes. And you know, you're right, of course, about, you know a lot more than I do about it, about the labor movement's destruction being part of the agenda. In 1970, when Powell wrote that memo, about 35% of American private employees were members of labor unions. And that, of course, that's what built the middle class. When we had a middle class, it was because of labor being able to negotiate and force and press, not just negotiate, but demand the wages and the benefits that created the middle class. That's gone. You know, we hear about labor, and the battle in Wisconsin, it was largely about the public sector unions, which also are important, but the private sector is down to about 7% or less of employees. And so that was one of those checks and balances. The government check that we all just get to decide, gone on corporate power. The labor check, gone. There's nothing left but us and that movement that Mike mentioned and said is so important, and I quite agree. I do think in terms of belling the cat, though, we have to define the narrative in many ways, and class is certainly one of them, but when you're talking about a constitutional amendment, you're talking about an American consensus where all but the most extreme are in favor of, for one reason or another. And now many, many Americans will say, if we want to rebuild the middle class, we have to recognize and disenthrall ourselves, as I mentioned, as Abraham Lincoln said so well, from notions that it isn't about class. But for others, we have to have other arguments, and because we need 3/4 of the American people to come on board this, and that's what I am working very hard to build, and I hope all of us will work hard to build. And that we don't pretend that the class issues aren't there. We don't pretend this isn't about you know, a corporate elite impoverishing the vast working class, but we say that and more, because if we also want to have a competitive, innovative economy that succeeds in a global world, we need to not have a pay-to-play, crony capitalism, you know, corrupt government. The American economy is innovative and vital when it is, because we have freedom and a functioning, stable democracy, and that's also at risk. So I think there's a whole lot of different arguments, and if all those amendments where people belled the cat they never would have thought possible passed for all kinds of reasons. The progressive income tax, I understand. You know, imagine being the folks who had to pass an amendment to get an income tax. But part of the reason is because the people who wanted the Prohibition Amendment had to explain, well, all that tax money that the government gets from selling booze, who's going to replace that? So there are weird, strange allies to say, well, I guess we need a progressive income tax to fix that. And so, you know, belling the cat will take everything. It'll take all the narratives we can muster, all the energy we can muster. And if I can say one last story, I'll talk about Doris Haddock, Granny D, who some of you may know. She passed away at 100 about a few months after Citizens United was decided. Granny D, in the 90s, decided, she lived in California, and she decided she was fed up with corrupt pay-to-play politics, and it wasn't nearly as bad then as it is now. And she was going to walk to Washington from California to give them a piece of her mind. And she did. She started walking. And she didn't know how she was going to get there. She didn't know, you know, who was going to feed her. She knew the general direction, and she started walking. And people came out to walk with her. They took her in to stay overnight. They brought her food and walked with her. Parts of the way she cross-country skied when the snows got high. And she was 89 years old. She turned 90 in the process of going 3,000 miles across the country to tell those you-know-whats in Washington to get some control on money and politics. And my colleague at Free Speech for People, co-founder of the organization with me, John Bonifaz, has been fighting these election integrity, voting rights and money and politics fights for a quarter century, was there along with Senator McCain, Senator Feingold, and many others to welcome her when Granny D finally arrived in Washington. And in part, that led to the passage of the McCain-Feingold that sadly the Supreme Court struck down. But you know, John went up to see her after Citizens United was decided, and she, as I said, she was just turning 100. And apparently she told him that she had in mind another walk now to deal with Citizens United. And unfortunately, she did pass away. But you know, John relates how he thought of you know, of her lifetime. You know, when she was born, women didn't have the right to vote. She was born into America where women didn't have the right to vote. She was born into an America that was very unlike what we see today. In her lifetime, 9 constitutional amendments were passed. 2/3 of Congress, 3/4 of the states, all in her lifetime. So Granny D is an example not only of the perseverance that could lead an 89-year-old woman to walk 3,000 miles across the country, but she is a testament to the idea and the truth that change does happen in a lifetime, and that we can decide to try to bell that cat, even if we don't know exactly how we're going to do it, even if we don't know exactly who's going to join us, even if we don't know exactly what the win looks like in the end. We start walking, we keep walking, and we get it done. So Granny D would tell us, let's get this done.
Thank you. Tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, for those who are here from our Fast Work Conference,